Thank you all very much for being here. We have an excellent talk from our Manchester University expert, Vanessa May, who is going, as you know, to talk about narrative analysis. So I'll hand over to her, and we're going to record her talk. So if you have colleagues who wanted to come and couldn't come, they can listen to the talk on the web. It will be up in about a week. So thank you, Vanessa, very much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, Angela. So yes, welcome all. This will be a kind of whistle-stop tour of narrative analysis. What I'm going to do is I'm going to whiz through the first maybe 4 bullet points there, and hopefully then I can spend a bit more time just talking about how I've got 2 examples of narrative analysis studies, and I think that's the best way of actually getting a grasp of what a method can do and whether it's something you might want to use for yourself. So that's what I'm going to cover in today's talk. And as Angela said, these slides are up on the web already, so if there's something I missed in the talk, you can always check the slides later. But first of all, I want to pose you a question. So when you want someone to know who you are, what do you do? So it's language. We're communicating with language. So when you experience something in your life and you want someone else to know about it, what do you do? For example, if you tell a story. Well, that's actually the second part of that question. So that's what I'm getting at here, is that the reason for why we might want to analyse narratives is because narratives are basically a very fundamental human way of communication. That's how we communicate our experiences, we communicate ourselves to other people through narrative. And narrative, basically what we do in a narrative is we tell someone about events and experience, a sequence of events. And in a narrative, we connect these events so that the events are connected to each other through some kind of logic. So our narratives generally have a plot. They have a kind of a general point that we're trying to put across. So basically, narratives are non-random sequences of events. So we don't just, put events together in any kind of incoherent fashion if we want to tell a story that other people can actually understand. There's also, in a narrative, usually there's some kind of movement in time. So first something happens, then you react to that, and the outcome is then something else. So there's movement in the narrative as well. And because this is such a fundamental way of communicating for humans, narrative analysts argue that this is the reason why it's important to analyse what people say or what they write, and analyse the narrative content of that. So analyse what people say and kind of focus on the storied element of what people are telling us. And also the questions at the start. I was trying to kind of indicate to you that narratives are everywhere. Wherever we look, we're going to find narratives, and I'll kind of list in a bit. I'll list the kinds of narratives that narrative analysts might be interested in looking at. And that last bullet point about narrative being constitutive of reality, that's a methodological point about how, in order to understand the world, we use language to understand the world, and we do that in narrative form. So narrative is a way for us to basically create meaning out of the experiences that happen to us. And there's also the argument that narrative, basically that our sense of self is in a fundamental way. We understand who we are in the narrative form. We understand who we are in the shape of stories. So we all have stories that we tell about ourselves. And there's a school of thought that argues that is basically ourself. That is our identity, the stories that we have about our experiences, the stories we use to explain to people who we are. So basically, narrative analysis studies texts, narrative texts. So in order to do a narrative analysis, you have to have a story. And for that, you might want to then check there are lots of works on how to define what a narrative is. And these narrative texts can be found, like I said earlier, narratives are everywhere. They basically abound. So we have narratives in the private and public domains. So, for example, we can be looking at naturally occurring narratives, for example, a discussion between two people, and we could use narrative analysis to analyse that. We've also got written narratives collected for research purposes. So, for example, I've done narrative analysis on written life stories. Researchers might also collect oral narratives from people, so that's kind of first-person accounts. But also kind of more public documents or texts have been analysed using narrative analysis. So, for example, policy documents. We can also analyse, for example, media texts using narrative analysis. And I've got examples from both the private and the public domain in a bit. And when I talk about narrative text, I mean text in a broad sense, so not just language, but we can also use photographs, film. Someone's even done narrative analysis on dance performances, I believe. So text is very broadly defined. And the key thing about narrative analysis is that it's interdisciplinary, so it isn't a one method. I can't give you here the formula for how to do narrative analysis. Narrative analysis is a very broad church, and there's a lot of different types of narrative analysis that you could do. So it's more of an umbrella term for a mix of different methodological approaches. Also, people from different kind of theoretical orientations might choose to use narrative analysis. So narrative analysis, as I said, is a very broad church within the social sciences. And like I said, it's interdisciplinary. That means it is used by people in a lot of different disciplines, and I've listed a few there. So sociology, psychology, we've got a few people from medicine here. So medicine and health, a lot of people in those disciplines will use narrative analysis. And the key thing here is that these disciplines also talk to each other. So, for example, I'm a sociologist, and narrative analysis came into sociology via psychology. So we pick and choose tools and concepts from other disciplines as well. So just a quick kind of history of how did we get to this point where narrative analysis, it's very firmly established now in the social sciences. It didn't used to be, but from about the 1990s onwards, narrative analysis has become increasingly popular. So, for example, you might want to do a search on articles with narrative analysis as the keyword, and the number of articles using narrative analysis in journal publications has increased from the 1990s quite steadily. So now we're in a situation where, in the social sciences at least, we've got several kind of key textbooks available that have been quite recently published. We've had textbooks published from about the early 1990s onwards, and I've listed two of the more recent ones there. There's also a dedicated journal called Narrative Inquiry that's published in the States. But the origins of narrative analysis outline kind of literary theory narratology. So, for example, I've had to read some theory around literature narratology. I've also read texts by psychologists and so on. So that's the kind of the interdisciplinary nature of narrative analysis. And within the social sciences, this interest or this kind of burgeoning popularity of narrative analysis, it's all part and parcel of a bigger movement, a bigger development. So in the social sciences, we've had what's called the so-called it's given several different names. It can be given a linguistic term. It can be called the narrative term. Basically, it means that within this kind of development within social sciences, there's an increased interest in the importance of language. So language as a way of constructing reality, as I already mentioned earlier. So it's through reality, basically, that we categorize things, we name things, we give meaning to experiences, things and events. And within this kind of linguistic term, there's a focus on linguistic conventions. So if we're talking about narrative analysis, it would be, for example, socio-cultural narratives are linguistic conventions. They are cultural conventional ways of telling particular types of story. And the focus is on within the social sciences, the focus is on the work that words do in interaction between people and the work that words do in society. And I'll say a few words about that, because that's very important. So social scientists using narrative analysis will view language as a social tool. So language isn't just neutral. Language is used to do certain things in society. So, I mean, there are various approaches. This is kind of my approach to narrative analysis, is that language isn't understood. I don't understand language to directly reflect or mirror an underlying reality. But rather, language is used, I view language as something that's used to do things. So language is used to categorize, for example, people. And this is where narrative analysis comes quite close to discourse analysis. How many of you are familiar with discourse analysis? So it's quite similar in terms of its approach to language. So language is used to kind of name and categorize and label, for example, people. And that has a significance within society, because language is also connected to power. So certain groups in society have more power to name things and to have that naming stick, as it were. So, for example, you might be interested in looking up Foucault and his theory of regimes of truth. So this approach to language within the social sciences views language as a significant tool for example, creating social inequalities. But like I've put there, I've put two references where you can have a look at people who might have a slightly alternative view to language, but are still doing social science narrative analysis. So the focus of narrative analysis is on meaning and interpretation. So the meanings that people give to their experiences, if we're looking at first-person accounts, the meanings that people give to their experiences, how they interpret an event, how they interpret their experiences, how do they interpret reality, social reality. And when we're looking at language from this point of view, it's very important to take into consideration who's doing the narrating. So people will narrate from a particular social position, and it's important to take that into consideration. But also who they're narrating to, so who they're telling a story to is important, and we'll look at that in a bit. But also, narrative analysts will often be wanting to kind of understand to what aim narratives are constructed and used. Why do people tell the stories that they do? So not only people, individual people, but for example, why would a particular government agency or department create a particular story about a sequence of events? So the context within which narratives are told or created is very important. And by context, I mean here both the broader social context, but also if it's a question of a narrative that's created in dialogue, so there's two or more people talking to each other or writing to each other, that dialogue, that context of dialogue, that what's going on between those two people will also shape that narrative. And as I said, this will all become clearer when we're looking at the actual examples of studies. And then just a few words about how you might want to do narrative analysis. So Lieblich et al., in a classic book on narrative analysis, they divide approaches to narrative analysis along kind of two axes. So they say that narrative analysis can either be holistic, that is, analysing each narrative as a whole, or narrative analysis can be categorical, that is, looking for categories or themes within narratives and then picking out these themes and analysing these themes across cases, as it were. So that's more the traditional cross-sectional analysis that a lot of social scientists do. The other axis is that of form and content. So narrative analysis can either be focusing on content, that is what is being told, or they can look at form, that is how it's being told. So, for example, narrative structure. And Reisman, she adds two more types to this. She talks about analysts who look at the kind of the dialogical aspect of narrative, like I mentioned earlier about how it's important to look at the interaction within which a narrative is produced. Also, visual narratives is another, so that's looking at the kind of the visual content of a photograph, for example. Now, most narrative studies, most but not all, are holistic. So they are focusing on narratives as a whole. That means that they're kind of preserving the narrative aspect of a story. So they're not picking out chunks of text to analyse outside of it. So the meaning is to analyse things within the context of that narrative, rather than kind of taking excerpts out of, say, for example, an interview transcript and analysing those excerpts out of context, as it were. I would say that most narrative studies also focus both on form and content. So we're interested in looking at both what people say, but also how they say it. Also, because we want to sort of keep, if you take a holistic approach, that basically means you're doing a case study approach. That also often limits the number of cases you can study, because narrative analysis does require quite close reading of text and kind of minute, kind of analysis of minute detail. So that does restrict the number of cases. Right, so for the rest of the time, I am going to talk to you about basically two different types of narrative that we might want to look at, and I'll give you an example of both. The first will be collective narratives, and the second will be about first-person accounts, so narratives that individuals tell. Collective narratives are narratives that, for example, institutions or organisations or political parties might tell. And just as kind of background, the argument for looking at collective narratives is that the social world is storied. So it's not just that we as individuals tell each other stories, but there are, for example, myths about, or stories about who we are as a people. For example, there are kind of stories about who we are as a nation, and I use kind of quotation marks between the we, because we is a constructed. So we construct a group, we construct us, we construct we through the narratives that we tell about ourselves. And there are collective ways of understanding how things should work or how things actually do work. And when we're looking at collective narratives, we're interested in how these narratives are linked to particular institutions or expert power or expert knowledge. For example, the medical profession. And I've got an example of a medical policy text to come up in a bit. And narrative analysis, it can be used to analyse both how narratives will reflect the context within which they're being told. So, for example, narratives will reflect the kind of social context within which that narrative is created. But narratives can also shape the world. Like I said, narratives are used to do things. They're used to label things, to make things happen. So, first of all, how narratives reflect the context within which they're told. They can reflect power relations, for example. Like I said earlier, certain groups in society have more power to name things and to sort of basically have their version of events taken as the version of events that's kind of right. There's also people whose narratives will then be excluded from these collective narratives. For example, today in Britain we have discussions about multicultural Britain and what does that mean? Whose narratives get excluded from that definition of what a multicultural Britain is. But also, like I said, narratives are used to do things, so they are used to achieve particular social ends. So sanction certain forms of knowledge, and again, the medical science comes into mind here. Narratives can be used to exclude or include certain groups of people, as I mentioned just now. Narratives are also used to construct social identities, and the example that I'll give you in a bit is an example of how narratives can be used to construct a kind of a hoped-for identity for a certain category of people. So there are power inequalities in relation to who gets to do things with narratives. So not everyone in society, has the same power to have their narrative actually shape the world. And that's an interest for people who are looking at collective narratives. I think, who is it who gets to do this defining of what's going on in the world? So the first example I've got is, it's an analysis of documents produced by the National Cancer Institute in the States. There's 11 of those documents, and Davis did a narrative analysis of these documents. And she said why she wanted to analyse these documents was because they are a major source of information for women who suspect they have breast cancer or for women who've been diagnosed with breast cancer. And she argues that it's important to study these and to look at the kind of the storied aspect of these documents, because the medical profession has a certain power and legitimacy in Western societies at least. So they get to define illnesses, they get to define categories of illness, but they also get to define treatments and what should be done. But they also get to construct sort of idealised patient identities for people with these particular illnesses. So in this case, Davis was interested in what was the kind of the hoped for or the idealised identity constructed for breast cancer patients. The reason why she used narrative analysis was, as she argues, is because narratives focus on values. So narratives are often stories about moral dilemmas, for example. So narratives will highlight which values are dominant within a particular group or a society. And she says that the narratives about sort of the idealised breast cancer patient told in these documents, they will reflect the values of that group, so the medical profession who are writing these documents for potential or actual cancer patients. So what Davis did was she identified what she calls a primary narrative. And she says that this primary narrative did reflect some certain underlying values and expectations. And we'll kind of go through those as we go through her analysis. So she basically said that this primary narrative, it constructed the ideal woman, so the ideal breast cancer patient who can be treated successfully, and then who after that can look forward to kind of recovery from breast cancer. So she said that is the idealised identity that's been created in these documents. And she analysed 6 dimensions of narrative. So here she's looking at narrative structure. She's looking at the form, not so much the content, but her focus is very much on the form. And within that, then the content of what's being said. So I'll have time to go through a few of these elements that she analysed. So first of all, the kind of the characterisation, the characters that occurred in these narratives. I won't go through all of those. You can read her article if you're interested. The main characters were the breast cancer patient. She's the heroine. The hero is the doctor. The cancer is the villain. And this patient also has various people in her life who are within these documents. They're kind of constructed as helpful and caring. So she's got a support network. So the ideal patient is the heroine, the doctor's the hero, helping her defeat the villain, and she has this support network behind her to do that. And these documents, by analysing these documents, Davis identified that there is a certain plot line running through all of these documents. So these documents present women a plot of this is what breast cancer looks like. This is what you will go through if you have breast cancer. So the first, of course, it starts from the pre-symptomatic stage. And within each of these stages, the documents define what the ideal breast cancer patient does or how she is within these stages. So before she actually, has cancer, each woman should be involved in kind of these pre-detection practices. So, for example, examining their own breasts. And then if a woman finds a lump, she should immediately go and seek her doctor. She should kind of go and see her doctor immediately. And then after, if it's diagnosed as breast cancer, the woman then becomes the patient, and the doctor becomes the person who is there. He is the hero to cure the villain, to cure the cancer. And during the treatment, the idealised breast cancer patient, she educates herself, she communicates with her doctor constantly, and she faces up to and addresses her own emotional fears. And then after the recovery and post-recovery stages are basically, again, the idealised patient, she heals both physically and emotionally. She's been through a transformative experience that, according to these documents, has a lot of positive effects as well. So that's basically the plot line and how the ideal cancer patient kind of deals with these various stages. And Davis says that what emerges out of these documents is two themes. First of all, that all women are at risk of breast cancer. That's basically the message from these documents. So all women are potential breast cancer patients. The second theme is that of control. So understandably, or not surprisingly, given that these are sort of medical documents created by the medical profession, the doctor is presented as ultimately in control. The doctor is the one who controls the treatment and helps the patient beat cancer. And the way that the patient, according to these documents, can maintain control is through educating herself. And Davis also argues that these cancer narratives, they medicalise women's experiences. So they medicalise the whole woman, beyond just the cancer. They medicalise the woman in terms of the patient is encouraged to go to her doctor with all of her fears, all of her concerns, whether they're medical or not. Although Davis says that a lot of physicians actually aren't equipped to deal with, say, the kind of the psychological issues around cancer. But also her life post-cancer is medicalised in these documents, because post-cancer, the breast cancer patient or the breast cancer survivor, as the documents name her, is constantly having to regulate and kind of check her own breast to see whether the cancer might reoccur. And then the second type of, or the second type of kind of text that narrative analysis might want to look at are first-person accounts. So these are narratives as told by individual people. And as social scientists, we don't just view an individual person's story as just fully emerging out of that individual, but rather we see that individual people, they use cultural frameworks or cultural tools in order to tell stories about themselves. And these socio-cultural narratives, they offer us tools, so they offer us tools of the possible stories that we might tell, but they also set limits as to what can be told, as Lawler has argued. So as social scientists, we'd be interested in how individual people draw upon these socio-cultural narratives. So for example, one area of interest is people who are stigmatised in one way or another, and how these stigmatised or marginalised people basically hold a dialogue with these dominant narrative frameworks and try and kind of alleviate any stigma that these frameworks might be placing on them. And the interest here is what people are trying to do with this narrative. So, for example, we might be interested in how people can construct an identity through narrative, or they might want to persuade the listener or audience that something has actually happened or that they are a particular kind of person. So my own research has been on presenting a moral self through personal narratives. As I already indicated earlier, another area of interest is how narratives are created in dialogue. So narratives are always, if a narrative is created in dialogue, that situation between the two or more people will actually affect the kind of story that's being told. And like I mentioned, we also want to take into account the broader social context as well in this. And the example that I'm going to go through here will give you an indication of what this means basically in practice. So Presser did interviews. So she did several interviews with men who'd committed serious violent crimes, including rape and murder. And she was interested in, she argues that the context within which these narratives are told should be analysed as data. And by context, she means the macro context, so that the social, economic and political context within which these stories are told. So, for example, these men's race or ethnicity, their social class, the fact that most of these men were incarcerated at the time of telling their stories. But she says that also the micro-level features of talk have to be analysed as data. So that is the actual interaction between her and the men that she interviewed. And she says that these narratives are told within relations of power. And there are several ways of interpreting relations of power, say between Presser and the men that she interviewed. First of all, they're in jail, she's not. They're men, she's women. And she kind of goes through some of these layers of power within those interactions. And she says that those have to be systematically analysed as well. And her analysis is a mixture of analysing the what, and analysing content, and also analysing the how, analysing form. She also does a mixture of holistic and thematic analysis. So first she coded data according to sociologically interesting themes, and then she kind of analysed these cross-sectionally, so analysed them across the cases. Then she moved on to focus on 8 aspects of these narratives within each narrative. So, for example, how the men talked about their true selves, how they talked about their self over time. So she would analyse these and again compare the different cases with each other. And then she developed a second generation of themes, and that was looking at the men's constructions of a moral self. So that was her analysing the what, of basically what these men were telling her. But then she said she was also interested in analysing the how. And she said that up till now, her analysis hadn't captured the interaction between herself and the men that she interviewed. So she was interested in capturing basically the flow of the interview and the kind of the interaction, what was going on in the interaction between herself and the men. And to do this, she created memos on each of the research participants. And these were basically running summaries of how these men's narratives unfolded, but also what she thought was going on between herself and that particular man at that time. And she says, so this is a constructionist view of language, as language not reflecting or mirroring a reality out there, but rather language being used to do something. So she doesn't view these narratives as the authentic story. She says that we can never access such a thing as an authentic story of a person, but rather these accounts are co-constructions. They are constructed by Presser and the men that she interviewed. And these narratives are therefore influenced by that interaction between these two people, particularly the power relations between them. And Presser then goes on to examine her own role in this co-construction of these narratives. And she says that the accounts are situated collaborative negotiation of narrated identities. So she's saying basically that both she and the men were narrating their own identities within these interactions. One of the aspects that she focuses on is that of gender and the idea of doing gender within an interview. So she says that they were both, she and the men she interviewed, were using their gender relations. So basically they were using their kind of gendered interaction in order to affirm an appropriately gendered self. So to present an appropriately gendered, an appropriate image of a man or a woman, basically. And in presenting she called it their decent selves to her, they were also positioning her as a heterosexual woman. So that was the gendered interaction that was going on between her and the men, was that they were both kind of presenting a gendered identity, but they were also trying to position each other within a particular gendered identity. So she says that the men that she interviewed tended to sort of show kind of signs of chivalry by, for example, giving her advice. So there was one guy who gave her advice on relationships with men. And she said this was quite a popular way of doing gender, doing masculinity for these men. And she says that this positioned her within a particular feminine within a particular femininity. So by doing this, they were saying to her, "You're a woman who needs advice on men from me." And this femininity, they were constructing her as vulnerable and also as heterosexual. But she says that the darker side of this was an attempt to control, so to assert some form of authority over her as well. But Presta says that, you know, it wasn't just the men trying to gender her. She was gendering herself and she was gendering them as well. The ways in which she might position herself as this vulnerable heterosexual woman was, for example, alleviating tensions. So sometimes these discussions, because they were about what these men had done, so the murders and the rapes that the men had done, sometimes the situation would get quite tense between her and the man. And she would try and alleviate that by changing the subject, for example. She also said that she didn't challenge the men's accounts, although several times she felt that she couldn't. So you've got an idea now of sort of, hopefully, broadly, what narrative analysis can do, and an indication of so that's only two types of analysis that you might be able to do with narrative analysis. If you're interested in finding out more, there's a Centre for Narrative Research at the University of East London. There's also that webpage at Anglia Ruskin, and I found another web resource for narrative psychology. But I would urge, there's also slides with references. The slides online will have references as well. So if you're interested, I'd say go try first read Reisman's book from 2008, and then Andrews and colleagues' book from 2008 as well. So those are really good starting points.